There are several types of mortgage-backed securities. So far, we have talked about the simplest structure, which is mortgage pass-through securities. With mortgage pass-through securities, the collateral is actual mortgage loans, and a major issue with mortgage pass-through securities is that of prepayment risk. Now we move to a slightly more complicated structure, which is CMO, or collateralized mortgage obligations. The creation of a collateralized mortgage obligation can help manage prepayment risk by distributing the various forms of prepayment risk among different classes of bondholders. For CMOs, the collateral is usually a pool of mortgage pass-through securities. So this is the first major point, that here our pool or our securitized assets are not mortgage loans, but they are actually mortgage pass-through securities. So this is the pool of mortgage pass-through securities, and based on this pool, we create multiple bond classes or multiple tranches, and prepayment risk is distributed across these tranches. Over the next few slides, we look at how this distribution of prepayment risk takes place. And I'll emphasize here, prepayment risk cannot be eliminated or removed. It can only be distributed across the different tranches. The creation of a CMO cannot eliminate prepayment risk. It can only distribute the various forms of this risk among various classes of bondholders. The CMO's major financial innovation is that the securities can be created to closely satisfy the asset liability needs of institutional investors, thereby broadening the appeal of mortgage-backed products. So what does this mean? If you think about different types of investors, they will clearly have different preferences in terms of extension and contraction risk. If you think about a pension fund, and this pension fund has liabilities which will come due after 20 years. Is this particular pension fund more concerned about contraction risk or extension risk? Such investors will prefer bond classes where the contraction risk is relatively low. There will be other investors who would prefer bond classes with relatively low extension risk. And by creating different bond classes where some have low contraction risk and others have low extension risk, the industry can keep multiple kinds of investors happier, and by giving investors what they want, the cost of funding becomes lower. This is a straightforward concept. If an investor is getting what he likes, then he will be willing to live with a lower rate. A lower rate for the investor means a lower cost for the institution that is raising funds. Over the next few slides, we will discuss some common types of CMO tranches. Specifically, we'll talk about sequential pay tranches, planned amortization class tranches, support tranches, and floating rate tranches. The learning objectives do not emphasize these particular types of tranches, so we don't need to get into too much detail. I'll just explain each of these types at a high level. Under CMOs, the simplest structure is the sequential pay structure. Here we are looking at a structure with 4 tranches. The total par value is 800 million. The coupon rate is the same for all 4 tranches. And here I'll connect with something we've said earlier. You might recall we talked about credit tranching and time tranching. Here only time tranching is taking place, since there is no credit risk associated with agency securities, which is what we are talking about here. Our entire discussion so far with mortgage pass-through securities and CMOs is based on agency securities. There is no credit risk, therefore there is no point talking about credit tranching. Now, the question really is, how are payments distributed across the 4 tranches, and how is the prepayment risk distributed? For payment of monthly coupon interest, this is the rule. Distribute monthly coupon interest to each tranche on the basis of the amount of principal outstanding for each tranche at the beginning of the month. This is fairly standard. Here is the interesting one. The rule for disbursement of principal payments. Disburse principal payments to tranche A until it is completely paid off. After tranche A is completely paid off, disburse principal payments to tranche B until it is completely paid off. Notice here that if they are prepayments, those prepayments first go to tranche A. So the life of tranche A is clearly going to be less than the expected life of tranche B, and so on, where the life of tranche D is expected to be the longest. Let's look at some numbers. What we see here in the first column is different PSA assumptions. Let's just start with a PSA assumption of 165. All the numbers in this box represent the average life. If we assume a PSA of 165, the average life of the collateral is 8.6. Recall that the collateral here is mortgage pass-through securities. So the mortgage pass-through securities with a PSA of 165 have an average expected life of 8.6 years. Now, given that if prepayments do come in, those prepayments first pay off tranche A. Clearly the life of tranche A is going to be low compared to the life of tranche B, and the life of tranche D is going to be the longest. Let's now talk about extension risk and contraction risk. Remember, if prepayment rates end up being faster than expected, then we face contraction risk. And notice that with any of these tranches, the life goes down. So tranche A's life only is 1.6 and tranche D's life also comes down. Now I'll ask the sort of question that might show up on an exam. Let's say you are an investor and you are extremely concerned about contraction risk. If you are concerned about contraction risk, which of these tranches will be most appealing to you? The answer is tranche D, because if you are concerned about contraction risk, you are concerned about the life of the security becoming too short, so you will definitely avoid tranche A, and between A, B, C and D, your preference would be for D, where chances are that the life of the instrument will be the longest. If there is another investor who is primarily concerned about extension risk, he doesn't mind a situation where the life of the tranche comes down, but it's a huge problem if the life of the tranche is extended, then clearly for that investor, tranche A will be preferable. So if extension risk is a major concern, then he will prefer tranche A. To summarize the main point then, with tranche A, the contraction risk is high and extension risk is low. With tranche D, the contraction risk is low and extension risk is high. With tranche D, this contraction risk protection comes because of tranches A and B, which are taking on the higher contraction risk. And with tranche A, the extension risk protection is coming because of tranches C and D, which are taking on higher extension risk. On the previous slide, we talked about the sequential pay structure. And if we consider tranche D, where the contraction risk is relatively low, even there, the life can vary from 7 years to 24 years depending on the prepayment rate. So there is a fair amount of variability. Let's say we have investors who are not comfortable with this much variability. For them, the solution is planned amortization class tranches or PAC tranches. On this slide, we'll study PAC tranches and support tranches, which allow us to have more predictability with PAC tranches. PAC tranches offer greater predictability as long as the prepayment rate is within a specified band. This specified band is also called the initial PAC collar, and I'll talk about this shortly. PACs offer protection against both extension and contraction risk. The greater certainty here in terms of the life of a PAC tranche comes at the expense of non-PAC tranches, which are also called support tranches. In many PAC structures, there can be multiple PAC tranches and multiple support tranches, but in this rather simple explanation, we will look at a structure with one PAC tranche and one support tranche. Now, what we see here is that as long as the prepayment rate is between 100 PSA and 250 PSA, the life of the PAC tranche is 7.7 years. This is the expected life. But notice the variability in the life of the support tranche. Here the variability is quite high. So what the support tranche is doing is it is offering protection for the PAC tranche, protection both in terms of contraction risk and extension risk. And more formally, let's read through excerpts from the curriculum. The support tranches defer principal payments to the PAC tranches if the collateral prepayment rates are slow. Support tranches do not receive any principal until the PAC tranches receive their scheduled principal repayment. Support tranches absorb any principal repayments in excess of the scheduled principal repayments that are made. This rule reduces the contraction risk of the PAC tranches. So these points are important. What is being said is if prepayment rates are faster than expected, then the support tranches absorb the extra principal that is being repaid. On the other hand, if principal payments or repayments are slower than expected, then the principal repayments, rather than going to the support tranche, go to the PAC tranche. And it is because of this that we have more predictability in terms of the life of the PAC tranche relative to the support tranche. I mentioned the term the initial PAC collar. Here the initial PAC collar is 100 PSA to 250 PSA. The collar implies that as long as prepayments are within this band or within this collar, then the life of the PAC is fairly predictable. If the support tranches are paid off quickly because of faster than expected prepayments, they no longer provide protection to the PAC tranches. So that is illustrated over here. If the prepayments are faster than 250, then the life of the PAC will be lower than 7.7 years. At the other end of the spectrum, if the prepayments are lower than 100, then the life of the PAC will be extended. But the major point here is that with the PAC structure, we have greater predictability in terms of the life of the PAC, and that predictability comes at the expense of the support tranche. We've talked about different kinds of CMOs such as sequential pay structures and PAC structures. Keep in mind that other CMO structures also exist. For example, there are tranches that pay floating rates even though the collateral pays a fixed rate. So you might be wondering how this can happen. The idea here is that a fixed rate tranche is equal to a floater plus inverse floater. If you look at interest rate over here, and we look at the payoff for a floater and an inverse floater, when interest rates go up, the payoff for a floater increases while the payoff for an inverse floater goes down. Notice that these two balance each other out. So collectively, the rate would be fixed. If we combine the floater and the inverse floater, the net effect would be a constant rate. And that's the point being made over here. So an SPV can issue both floaters and inverse floaters even though it is receiving a fixed rate. If interest rates go up, the SPV will be paying more for the floater but less for the inverse floater, and the two balance out. If interest rates go down, let's say interest rates were originally here and interest rates go down, then the SPV is paying more for the inverse floater but less for the floater, and again the two will balance each other out. So this way the SPV can issue floating rate securities, and investors who believe that interest rates will go up will invest in floaters, whereas investors who believe that interest rates will go down will invest in inverse floaters. And essentially what is happening here is that through this structure, investors with different views on interest rate movement will have their investment options. So far, we have talked about agency mortgage-backed securities, which are guaranteed either by a government agency or by a government-sponsored enterprise, generally referred to as a GSE. With agency bonds, the only real risk that we were concerned about was prepayment risk. Now we move to the world of non-agency mortgage-backed securities. These are not backed by the government or by a GSE. Hence, credit risk is a major concern, and we will talk about that on this slide. Another point to be made here is that ultimately agency mortgage-backed securities are backed by conforming mortgages. With non-agency mortgage-backed securities, that is not the case, and the mortgages are not necessarily conforming. Earlier in this lecture, we have talked about the concept of conforming mortgages. Now, some important characteristics of non-agency mortgage-backed securities. There are two important mechanisms that you need to be aware of. The first one is that cash flows are distributed by rules such as the waterfall that dictate the allocation of interest payments and principal payments to tranches with various degrees of priority or seniority. Now, we don't need to get into the details here, but if there are multiple tranches or bond classes such as A, B, C, and so on, there might be rules which say that payments first go to A and then to B and then to C, and very roughly speaking, this might appear to be like a waterfall. Hence, these rules or some of these rules are referred to as the waterfall. The second point is that there also need to be rules for the allocation of realized losses, and this is important because now credit risk is a possibility, and it is possible that there will be defaults on some of the mortgage loans. If there are defaults, that means there will be losses. If there are losses, then how will those losses be allocated? Rules have to be defined, and that's what we are talking about here. So these rules must specify that subordinate bond classes have lower payment priority than senior classes. In a sense, what is happening here is credit tranching, which we have talked about briefly before. There might be different bond classes such as A, B, C. We might say that A is the senior bond class and bond class C is the most subordinated bond class. We might say that if there are losses, then C will have to absorb the losses first, and then losses will have to be absorbed by bond B, and finally by A. If as investors we want to forecast the cash flows associated with each of these bond classes, then clearly we need to make assumptions about default rates, and we also need to make assumptions about recovery rates. This is material that we talk about in more detail in other readings. Next point. In order to obtain favorable credit rating, non-agency mortgage-backed securities and non-mortgage asset-backed securities often require one or more credit enhancements. At a high level, we can either have internal credit enhancements or external credit enhancements. Let's talk about internal credit enhancements first. Here are three types of internal credit enhancements: senior subordinated structures, reserve funds, and over-collateralization. We have talked about the senior subordinated structure several times. So if we have bond A as senior, B as subordinated to A, and C as subordinated to B, then through this structure, clearly A has a higher credit rating relative to B and C. So we can say that through this structure, A has been given some credit enhancement. In terms of reserve funds, there are two forms that this can take. One is simply extra cash. So this would be a deposit made by the SPV. Obviously, if there is extra cash that is added by the SPV, that makes investors more comfortable, and this is one type of an internal credit enhancement. Another category here is an excess spread. The idea here is also fairly straightforward. Let's say that our pool of collateral pays a rate of 6%, and let's say that the service cost and other costs amount to 1%, which means that 6% minus 1% gives us a pass-through rate or a rate of 5%. But the amount that needs to be paid to the investors or the bondholders is 4.5%. So this extra 0.5% represents the excess spread. When there is an excess spread, that also is one type of an internal credit enhancement. We can also have over-collateralization. If in our structure the total collateral is worth 550 million and the bonds issued have a total par value of 525 million, then the extra 25 is the over-collateralization, which means that even if there are losses, some of those losses can be absorbed by the fact that we have over-collateralization. External credit enhancements are also quite common. Here we are talking about financial guarantees or a financial guarantee by a third party, such as a monoline insurance company. Monoline insurance companies are private companies which are focused on providing guarantees for financial products such as asset-backed securities and mortgage-backed securities.